Greetings from ATO headquarters in Indianapolis. With the 86th Congress coming up soon, we thought it'd be interesting to go back and take a look at what the first few ATO Congresses were like with our archivist, Deborah Walters, who's a graduate student at the University of Illinois. Several years ago, Illinois and ATO formed an agreement in which ATO transferred its archives to the safekeeping at the University of Illinois. And Deborah, working with the ATO archives, is full of information about ATO history. Today, we're going to talk with her about the first few Congresses. I'm Wynn Smiley, and this is the ATO Show. Deborah, thank you for joining us today. This is the first of what I think will be several ATO Show episodes looking at ATO's history through the ATO archives. And ATO is very fortunate that back in the mid-1990s, Alpha Tau Omega and the University of Illinois forged an agreement in which the Illinois archives system, U of I's archive system, would handle the ATO archives. And so everything that was in the headquarters got cataloged and sent over to U of I and the archives, and now it's being professionally handled by the University of Illinois archive system. So we have a treasure of information, and I think much will be very interesting. And so I anticipate an ATO archives show from time to time. Today, because we're very close to the 86th Congress of Alpha Tau Omega, I thought, and Deborah thought this would be a good idea, to talk about past ATO Congresses, with the first ATO Congress being held in Lexington, Virginia in 1870. So 5 years after the founding, they finally held the first Congress. So Deborah, as the archivist for ATO, tell us about the 1870 First Congress of Alpha Tau Omega.
Yeah, it was held in 1870, 5 years after ATO was founded, but that was on purpose. Founder Glazebrook had planned, when he wrote the initial Constitution, he wrote in that within the first 5 years of founding, the Congress would be held because he wanted ATO to be governed by delegates from across the national fraternity that he had envisioned. And so they changed the Constitution to reflect the change from the previous 5 years was governed by the Mother Society, which was Virginia Alpha, the first chapter to be formed. And the Constitution changed to say we're now governed by nationally representative officials. So it was a big change for the fraternity, but obviously it's held through, and it reflected ATO's founding promise to become a truly national fraternity, which was a new idea at that time.
So no one was really surprised, because in terms of moving from the Alpha or the Mother Society and determining the governance for the national organization, which was common among all fraternities. ATO was the first, Glazebrook was the first to say he wanted a democratically represented national fraternity with a Congress. No one was really surprised coming at the first Congress that was going to be something that would be changed, right? Because that would sort of always been in the works.
Right. Yeah. And so the very first thing you'll see in the minutes of the first Congress was the senior Grand Master of the Virginia Alpha chapter took the chair, and he announced that he was instructed by the Mother Society to transfer into the hands of the Congress the authority heretofore vested in them. So this was already supposed to happen. This was the whole point of them gathering in Lexington in 1870.
Yeah, do we know how many people attended the first Congress, Deborah?
Yeah, so by 1870, there were 12 chapters. 7 of those were collegiate chapters, and 5 of them were community chapters, so chapters that we could think of them sort of as alumni chapters. But at this Congress, there were 10 delegates from those 12 chapters. for a total of 26 members. And at that time, they thought that was a really great showing. So they'd be really surprised by how many people show up at Congress these days. But yeah, so a total of 26. There weren't any founders at this Congress, but there were a lot of movers and shakers.
That's right. So Glazebrook would have been the only person anywhere close to Lexington. By this time, Ross had already moved to California as a judge, and Marshall was in Alabama in Reconstruction working for a railroad, so they would not have come back. So in addition to what was rubber stamping in terms of the Constitution and the national officers, there were a couple of other items of business that they would not have planned for way ahead that they took action on. Can you tell us about those, Deborah?
Sure. So in addition to just doing the Constitution stuff, they did establish permanent committees at this Congress, which of course would hold through to other Congresses. And these would be, of course, the Committee on Constitution, on Finance, on Initiation, Bylaws, and Signs of Recognition and Distress. So these would hold through. And then, of course, there were other committees that were formed just temporarily at this Congress. There was one that was formed to decide whether they should recommend closing chapters that were no longer active. So I mentioned there were 12 chapters that were founded by 1870. Not all of them were still running. Some of them only had like one or two members that were trying to find other ATOs around to join, but they did form a committee at this Congress just to discuss whether they should consider pulling charters.
Yeah, so you have the minutes. You have the minutes in front of you.
Right.
As you read through the minutes, did anything pop out at you? Any kind of the sense of the feelings, that the atmosphere of Congress, or side conversations that may be happening, or just the general tone and texture of what was happening in 1870 with these men?
It seemed very optimistic. That was the overall tone for me. The overall feel was that everyone was really excited to be there. They wanted to continue expanding ATO, following that founding principle of going further north, further west. So there were more charters that were granted. There were 2 more charters that were granted. And actually, the closing remark at the very end of the meeting minutes was that they called the first Congress a most harmonious and agreeable meeting, which I think encapsulates the whole feeling of that time.
And really, for Congresses, the first Congress was sort of the high point for the next few Congresses. Little did they know what lay ahead. Right. So sort of moving through after the first Congress, second, third, fourth Congress, give us a sense of what was going on as everyone gathered for the second Congress, the next one, and what was happening within ATO.
Right. So the next few years, really throughout the 1870s, ATO had sort of hit a rough patch, as a lot of fraternities were at that time. In the ATO story, they call the time from about 1871 to 1876 the lean years. There were a lot of chapters that had become inactive. They weren't showing up to Congress. The 26 members that showed up to the first Congress was sort of the highest number that they hit until about 1878, 1880, when they were back up at like 40 members. But yeah, the members in ATO, there was some sort of disconnect with this centralized government, and it was really hard for new chapters to get off the ground. Those 2 charters that I mentioned that were granted at this first Congress, neither of them were actually used right away. One of them for Richmond College wasn't used until 1878, so 8 years after it was granted. The other one was not used at all. The man whom it was granted to went up. It was for the University of Chicago. He went up to Chicago. No one was interested in joining. And so at the second Congress, he went back. He said, "It didn't work out. Can I have a charter for a community chapter? Because that might work better than at the college." So he got a charter for a community chapter. But even that, it took him another 3 years for him to gather enough interest to form a community chapter in Chicago. And there were a lot of chapters that were really struggling like that to get members and to have that sense of community and to bring those members to Congress. But eventually, through 1870, they had found what ATO likes to call the second founder, Joseph Anderson, who had a real connection with the vision of ATO.
So let's go back to the 1870 Congress when they granted the charter for the University of Chicago. So just from an ATO context standpoint, Glazebrook wanted a national fraternity. He didn't want a regional fraternity, and so granting a charter for, of all places, at VMI, to place a charter at the University of Chicago in the state of Illinois was radical, I would guess. And had that charter taken, it would have been the first charter north of the Mason-Dixon line versus what became the first charter north of the Mason-Dixon line several years later at Penn. So Glazebrook, from the very beginning, has always, I don't think many people really appreciate how radical Glazebrook and of course Marshall and Ross were, but really Glazebrook was in his idea for not only creating a peace organization to reunite the North and the South, but to have a national fraternity and to push north of the Mason-Dixon line so quickly after chartering. And I just think that speaks to how different at that time ATO was in terms of its vision for moving quickly to a national entity.
Yeah, and they were really invested in pushing this national idea. And actually on that charter for the University of Chicago chapter, the charter itself was printed before the Congress. So on it was printed, the charter was granted by the Mother Society, which is what they called the Alpha chapter, Virginia Alpha. But the man who wanted to form this Chicago University chapter approached them at this Congress and said, I want to form this chapter. And they must have been really excited to push up into Illinois. And so they granted this charter, and instead of, waiting until maybe the next Congress to reprint the charter or maybe mail it to him by Pony Express, they crossed out Mother Society and wrote in General Congress because they wanted to grant this charter then and there.
Absolutely.
So,
and you have, the archives has that actual charter in its possession.
Yeah, which is, it's a really cool artifact to have. We don't have a ton of materials from that early on because, back then there were a lot of ATOs that were worried about alien hands getting on their old charters and even old constitutions that had been revised. But somehow we have this charter, and there's a lot of cool information like that can be found from these documents.
Yeah, and we'll before we get done, we'll talk about how alumni can engage in some of the archival material if they're interested. So let's go back. Though, moving from the first Congress, things didn't go so well. Perhaps not surprisingly, all of a sudden you had chapters who are now potentially reporting to central office or an umbrella, a national umbrella. Even though they had a vote, they didn't have that construct before. So coming to a Congress to hear what was happening may not have been as interesting. Who knows what was going on at that time? But by the fourth Congress in 1876, things had gotten so bad that a lot of the delegates did not show up. There was a pretty sizable accounts receivable in term guys not paying their dues. And so part of that discussion at the fourth Congress was whether or not just to pull the plug on Alpha Tau Omega and let it die a peaceful death, or try one more time. And so the fourth Congress, they elected Joseph R. Anderson. Every ATO knows him as the second founder. What can you tell us, Deborah, about what was happening at that Congress?
Yeah, so really, even the senior Grand Chief didn't show up to that Congress. It was really rock bottom. And during this Congress, they were trying to think, what do we do to pull ATO together? Because everyone who had showed up to this Congress were dedicated. And so they were thinking, of who they could call to do the work. And they thought of Joseph R. Anderson.
Who wasn't even there. Anderson was not at that Congress.
No, he was not represented.
That's the ultimate. You better show up or you'll get assigned something in your
Right.
absence. He did that, and so the Congress sent a delegation out to talk to Anderson, telling him that he had just been elected, and would he be willing to take the charge to lead the fraternity. And he said he would, but he would only do it. He only had time. He was a very successful businessman, and he only had time to do it for a short amount of time, but he really wanted to get some work done if he was going to do it. And he had a provision in particular, was that Glazebrook, Otis Allan Glazebrook, who you had mentioned earlier, had not been to a Congress yet and had really disengaged from the fraternity, not because of any issue per se, just simply because he was busy with his career and his family at the time. But Anderson wanted Glazebrook to re-engage as a condition for him to accept him leading. Glazebrook did. So what can you tell us about what Anderson did as he took over leading the fraternity?
Yeah, so by the 1878 Congress, which was when Anderson was really taking charge, we could see that the Constitution was really reworked. And this is where we can also see Glazebrook's influence. And we can also see when the Creed was written in 1880, that was, you could say, influenced by Anderson bringing Glazebrook back into the fold. And there was, again, I didn't mention this earlier, but there was nomenclature change at the first Congress in 1870 that created the Greek naming system that ATO has, but in a different type of way. There was Virginia Alpha, Virginia Beta, but there was also, they had decided in 1870 it would be by state. So Kentucky Alpha, Kentucky Beta, if that was what had existed at that time. But in 1878, when Anderson took charge, he said that will be too confusing if we're really expanding on a national level, which is what ATO was about. So he said, we're going to change this in 1878 to reflect what we envision. So that changed and became what the naming system is today. But he really cleaned up what was happening. They created a catalog of members, which I think probably held members more accountable. He was reaching out to people and chapters. And by the 1878 and 1880 Congresses, there were more delegates showing up to Congress. In the minutes, we can see Anderson gave really long, impactful speeches. And I think he really inspired a lot of those delegates at Congress and even outside of Congress through his writing and through his work, even in just a short year or two, to continue pushing for ATO and ATO's vision.
Really, because after that Congress, things were on a positive trajectory. So Glazebrook now re-engaging with ATO probably did a lot to get everyone focused and pumped up about the future of the fraternity.
Right. Yeah. I imagine having the founder finally come to Congress after 8 years of Congress existing would make people excited to go.
Right. And Anderson asked Glazebrook to do, among other things, 3 very important things. You had mentioned the Creed.
Right.
So Anderson asked Glazebrook to write basically what we call today the mission statement of ATO, the Creed. The ritual from 1865 until 1880 was, parts of it were the same as they are today, but a lot of it was very different, and it was problematic in certain ways. And so Anderson asked Glazebrook to rewrite the ritual. So the ritual that we use, the initiation ceremony that is used today, is what was written in 1880 by Glazebrook. And then finally, Anderson asked Glazebrook to write the reason he started the fraternity. At the time, for whatever reason, there was a rumor going around that Ross was the principal founder of ATO, and that wasn't true, but nevertheless, it was out there in the wind, and Anderson wanted to put an end to that rumor, so he simply asked Glazebrook to write his reason for starting the fraternity. And actually, that document is framed and hanging in the headquarters lobby. So those 3 things, among other things, really set the trajectory which all three of those things actually are still relevant and in use today.
Yeah, definitely.
So now, Deborah, anything else on these early Congresses that jumped out at you in looking through the minutes, or just in a sense of what was going on that we haven't covered that would be interesting?
I mean, something that I personally found interesting was their community chapters. I sort of mentioned it earlier, but they sort of went back and forth on it a whole bunch. And I think it's because they didn't really have alumni chapters back then. They didn't have that thought yet. But in 1870, they abolished community chapters. And it's not revealed in the minutes why they did that. Actually, the minutes back then are pretty bare bones compared to some of the later minutes, which are full like books. But yeah, they abolished community chapters in 1870, which were pretty much alumni and younger ATO members also in cities and towns, sometimes associated with an institution, sometimes not. So that would be, there was one in Harrisonburg, Virginia, one in like Memphis, Tennessee, back in 1870. But then in 1872, at the second Congress, only 2 years later, they reinstituted community chapters because I guess there were enough people that were interested in them. But then in 1876, at the fourth Congress, they abolished them again. But this time, when they abolished them, they said, let's give them a replacement. And so they created alumni chapters, which seemed to be a good replacement because eventually those became alumni associations, and that's what existed.
Which we still charter today. The board of directors still approves charters
Exactly.
for alumni associations applying, but the community chapters were definitely not successful. Thought they would be.
Not.
A great idea on paper, did not
Yeah.
play out in real life.
Right. And at that first Congress, the only thing that they said in the meeting minutes was that they just decided we only want to grant charters at institutions of learning.
Right, yeah. So you have been a graduate student at the University of Illinois for about a year. You came on as the Thomas Alco Clark graduate assistant for the archives, working for ATO as part of your responsibilities. What have you learned about ATO, being around the history of ATO and all of the documents and archives as you have been working for the past year with a lot of ATO material?
Yeah. I mean, there's such a dense history. There's so much to learn, honestly. And, I'm coming at it from an archivist point of view, but you could come at it from obviously a fraternity point of view, but you could also look at it from a journalist point of view. You could look at it from a photographic history point of view. Like, really, there's so much to learn from all of the different collections, and it's been really exciting. Even just looking at, some of the photographs that we have that do date back to 1865 that are in, we have tintypes, which is the craziest thing, but you can learn so much about history, even seeing how World War I affected fraternities and life on campus. And that's been really, really interesting. And just over the years, how ATO has changed and sort of reflected the social campuses. And it's been fascinating to learn, and to just get my hands on the documents has been a great experience.
That's great. That's great. So I know much of the collection is online, and indexes of the collection certainly online. So if an alum isn't going to be in Champaign-Urbana anytime soon, is there a way that they can see some of the archives online? What's the access for an ATO alum if he's interested in finding out more?
Yeah, so we do have a website. It's library.illinois.edu/SLC/national-fraternity-collections/ATO, or they could email me, dw6@illinois.edu, and I'd be happy to help. But yeah, we have a database online of all of the ATO materials, and some things are already digitized, but we're happy to digitize more if there's an interest. And if there's interest in research, we're always happy to help. But there's really a whole lot of material that's just waiting to be looked at.
Both at the national level and the chapter level.
Right,
Every chapter has its own section.
Yeah. So we have files from every single chapter that's ever existed, all, 250 or so. So really anything that anyone would want in regards to ATO for an alum to look at.
Absolutely. So I know I'm going to get this question if I don't clarify. So as part of the agreement that we struck with the University of Illinois, we, for example, said the ritual cannot be made public,
Right.
and a few other things are not available to the general public, but because Illinois is a research institution, and because of what Deborah said as it relates to researchers looking at history, student life, not just fraternity student life, but student life in general, we encourage researchers to take a look at the collection. And in fact, and any researcher that requests, the National Fraternity has to approve that request. But we have gotten several requests over the years of researchers looking at a variety of things related to student life and using the ATO archives. And so just to be clear, the ritual is not public, so researchers can't look into the ritual. Nobody can unless you're an ATO. And but we're excited about what we're able to provide to student life history related to fraternity life and ATO life. So, Deborah, I appreciate very much the time you've taken. I think that this is very interesting information. And as I said at the top, we'll probably do this again on another topic soon as we explore the ATO archives.